The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical Psychology for Today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, voiced by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from A Perfumed Scorpion by Idries Shah. This audio has been made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. 4. The Teaching Story, Part 1. People who speak little need only half a brain. Italian proverb. I can think of no better way of beginning a consideration of stories than with a very short, true story about the situation, the real intricacies, of dealing not only with stories, but with the talking and hearing process itself. I was giving a lecture recently on the difficulty which people have in taking things in, especially at any speed, even if they do it sequentially, and how a story, or even a statement, might become a person's possession, as it were, so that it could be recalled to mind and considered from various points of view. It has been noticed, I continued, that much information is not absorbed because many people cannot really absorb something when they have heard it only once. Immediately a hand went up, and someone sitting in the front row asked me, "Would you mind saying that again?" I later inquired and found out that he was neither hard of hearing nor a quick-witted humorist. This time lag between the presentation of materials and their integration into the thinking and repertoire of action of the individual has itself to be taught, we find, to quite a lot of people interested in stories. It is useful to other people too, but we find it easy to observe and to test in the storytelling and story-hearing atmosphere. The holistic mode will obtain certain parts, and the more literal others. Neither will perceive many dimensions until a skill has been developed. This short Sufi tale is employed for the educational purpose of establishing in the mind the contention, at least, that one may need this time-lapse for this purpose, and it is not intended to make fun of any of the fictional figures appearing in it. Thyme and Pomegranates. A disciple went to the house of a Sufi physician and asked to become an apprentice in the art of medicine. "You are impatient," said the doctor, "and so you will fail to observe things which you will need to learn." But the young man pleaded, and the Sufi agreed to accept him. After some years, the youth felt that he could exercise some of the skills which he had learned. One day, a man was walking towards the house, and the doctor, looking at him from a distance, said, "That man is ill. He needs pomegranates." "Oh, you have made the diagnosis. Let me prescribe for him, and I will have done half the work," said the student. "Very well," said the teacher, "providing that you remember that action should also be looked at as illustration." As soon as the patient arrived at the doorstep, the student brought him in and said, "You are ill. Take pomegranates." "Pomegranates?" shouted the patient. "Pomegranates to you! Nonsense!" And he went away. The young man asked his master what the meaning of the interchange had been. "I will illustrate it the next time we get a similar case," said the Sufi. Shortly afterwards, the two were sitting outside the house, when the master looked up briefly and saw a man approaching. "Here is an illustration for you, a man who needs pomegranates," he said. The patient was brought in, and the doctor said to him, "You are a difficult and intricate case, I can see that. Let me see. Yes, you need a special diet. This must be composed of something round with small sacs inside it, naturally occurring. An orange? No, that would be the wrong colour. Lemons are too acidic. Ah, I have it. Pomegranates." The patient went away, delighted and grateful. "But, master," said the student, "why did you not say pomegranates straight away?" Because, said the Sufi, he needed thyme as well as pomegranates. Now, this tale usually produces some laughter, but sometimes, especially in cultures where people have acquired the habit of turning as many things as possible into wisecracks, we occasionally get such comments as, "That patient was a real idiot, wasn't he?" Abolition of impact. The abolition of the impact of a story or other stimulus is, of course, well known as a device, a way of avoiding the assimilation of its point, and this behavior can frequently be seen in people who have the need, displayed, too, in other ways, of protecting themselves against outside influences. Other tales are used as a corrective to this, enabling people to laugh at themselves or to recognize that there is no sin in being prone to the same deficiencies as very many other people are. I have come across very few reactions as dramatic as the one which followed my first publication, in 1969, of an ancient narrative about dramatic reactions. In something like 1,500 words, well spaced out and occupying 9 pages with plenty of white space, I retold the legend of the man who had a very big book with only a few words written in it, the words being concerned with how people judged by appearances and confused the container with the content, as it were, and were enraged when they found that this book had so few words in it. These 9 pages were printed and published as a book, with some 300 other blank pages to bulk it out. The external shape, size, and weight of this volume, which I entitled The Book of the Book, presumably gave the impression that it had words right the way through, was filled with words, and the cover was gold embossed. There was an immediate outcry. Reviewers, seeing that it had only 9 pages of print, manifested their rage and disappointment at such a product. None of them, at first, noticed that it was a book about people who were seized by rage and disappointment when a book turned out to have nothing in it except something about people who were annoyed when they found that a book only warned about the container and the content. Presently, however, one by one, other reviewers started to see the point and to give it good reviews. It has now run through 4 editions, but not before an expert at the British Museum in London unhesitatingly declared that it was not a book at all, until we found a book which proved that it really did fulfill the criteria of a book laid down by UNESCO. Now and again I see references to it as causing a sensation or as experimental and new, even in the London Times. The confusion of the container and the content, of course, is a very common human tendency, causing the worship of externals and producing magic wand-type thinking, but for some reason called cargo cultism only when it is found among underdeveloped peoples. The argument and illustration that there are these 2 modes, the inner and the outer shape, by means of stories such as this, makes it possible for the student to recall and replay, as it were, the model story, and then to study his own behavior to see whether, perhaps, he is developing a tendency towards superficiality, magical thinking, or incomplete attention. Analogical teaching. Sufi analogical teaching has an interesting dimension which, as one becomes more familiar with it, can be observed almost everywhere. This is summed up in the statement that things which have a mental form also have a physical one, and also a form reflected in social happenings. If the container is the human being, the content may be called the nature and quality of his inner self, whether you call this psychological, educational, or spiritual. Sometimes you can see the literal disparity between container and content displayed, almost as a moral lesson or even as a social drama in real life. This is what gives teaching stories their reality, and also endows teaching narratives, accounts of contacts between teachers and learners, their vitality. Here is an example of how the human neglectfulness of container and content in the inner sense can actually concretize itself in a real-life occurrence. Last year, the London Times reported that one local authority in a British county had received a parcel on which they had to pay a heavy excess postage charge, since it bore no stamp. It was so badly packed that it had burst open in transit. Inside this interesting package, this container with such a disastrously negligent outwardness, what do you think there was? Nothing less than 200 leaflets from the Post Office Users Council. They were entitled, "Have you a complaint about the post office?" Here is another one, picked almost at random, which raises even deeper questions about container and content. Nutrition from the container. 4 years ago, it was stated that scientific tests had been carried out on the characteristics of various breakfast cereals and their containers. Rats were fed, in laboratory conditions, on diets of both the contents and the containers. The results indicate, and I quote, that the box cardboard is often more nutritious than the cereals inside. I would draw a lesson from these instances to warn against assumptions about what one puts in imagined Sufi study, and what is really there, let alone what one puts it into. When people have in fact become attached to externals, stories, often jokes, can be used to enable them to acquire a more constructive perspective. In Sufi circles, it is not uncommon for a Sufi to prevent attachment to himself from the students, and to draw attention to the total phenomenon of the Sufi enterprise instead. We can take a story such as this one to impart the shock which takes concentration off superficialities or irrelevancies, so that it may attach itself to something more fundamental, if less palpable. Innermost feelings. Now here is a Western story, but it will serve for this purpose. There was once a man who travelled to a far distant land to seek spiritual enlightenment. Finally, he arrived at the dwelling of a sage who was reputed to be a master of secrets. At the precise moment that he was ushered into the presence of the Great One, a strange agitation seized him, and he fell onto the ground, feeling that the very earth might open up and swallow him. At last, he stammered, you have stirred my innermost being, master of spiritual exaltation. I am afraid I do not quite understand, said the venerable teacher, how you can imagine that you can benefit from what was, in fact, only an earthquake. We have a lot of them around here, you know. It should be remembered that Sufi educational technique aims at removing, or helping to remove, superficial behavior pattern barriers to deeper understanding. This is because the concept of the exclusion of limiting factors is every bit as important among the Sufis as the inclusion of concepts and the use of special techniques for stimulating perceptions. Indeed, the former must precede the latter. Because most people will tend to adopt the outer practices of people and institutions which they respect or admire, many Sufi tales provide humorous or semi-humorous formats, which can be recalled to mind to reduce this incrustation's effect in such cases. Most of the Sufi and other spiritual schools publicly known, whether here or elsewhere, are visibly, and for the Sufi, effectively, disabled in their learning potential by exactly this accretion problem. There is a tale which covers this, though it, like many other Sufi stories, also carries other dimensions which come to light when the consciousness is able to deal with them. Stealing advice. A man once applied to a Sufi to become his disciple, but was rejected, as not being ready for this path. So he decided that he would learn what he could by direct methods. What could be wrong in adopting Sufi practice? Finding out that a new disciple was being enrolled that evening, he climbed onto the roof of the Sufi meeting place and listened to the first instructions being given by the teacher. Do not walk on the left-hand side of a street. Do not avoid a fortunate person. Do not push yourself forward before others." Well, that seemed easy enough to the eavesdropper, who naturally at once proceeded to apply these teachings to his own life. But as he was walking home along the right-hand side of a street, a pot plant fell on him from a balcony and he was injured. Making friends with a prosperous merchant, all that happened was that the man swindled him. Finally, when he tried to apply for employment to feed himself, as he had lost all his money, he found that there were always other applicants there first, and without pushing, he was unable even to obtain an interview. Now, the tale continues, did he realize that the instructions were prescribed only for the man whom the Sufi had been talking to? Certainly not. He concluded that the Sufi was a fraud, even an agent of the devil. And of course, it was because he was not yet ready for calculated, measured instructions that the Sufi had rejected his candidature in the first place. These story structures, in addition to displaying common features of human action, have two major functions. The first is to provide indications of the barriers to learning. The second is to place in the hands of the student the means to administer, to some degree, self-correction through feedback. These tales are used instead of community disciplines because Sufis do not organize into monastic or other orders in which people are conditioned. The reason for this, of course, is that Sufis hold that such training may become another form of straitjacket and tends to produce automatism and conditioned response behavior. Removing the element of choice in thought and action, which is only available when the alternatives are known and the conditioning does not impose a certain so-called choice. The Sufi orders, known to history, are late elaborations of the externals of schools. Although many of these so-called orders are named after their putative founders, they are later developments. Even historical research concurs in general with authentic contemporary Sufi teaching that there is neither proof nor reason for great teachers of the past actually organizing such restrictive institutions. Indeed, it would make nonsense of much of their teaching if they did. Like any other instruments, Sufi tales can be misused, and when, as is not infrequently true, both the supposed teacher, who tries to apply the stories from, say, books and is not himself a product of them, and the would-be learner are not operating within the real Sufi frame, nothing useful will happen at all. Unless you call propaganda or emotional stimulus useful, and you can get those anywhere. The symptoms. The following passage indicates one side of the situation which then obtains. Someone asked a wise man, "I have heard that humanity is suffering from an ailment which prevents men and women from seeing truth, from knowing themselves. What is the main symptom?" He answered, "The first symptom is to believe that one is not suffering from this illness at all. But when it really starts to take hold, the patient may agree that he is ill, but now insists that the disease is anything other than actually it is." This disordered perception is very marked in heroic but ill-considered attempts at obtaining esoteric knowledge, which really means simultaneous knowledge, all over the world today. Sufi teaching takes place within a system which is much more often than not indirect. It is sometimes unperceived at the moment of its operation, though not always in its externals. The 13th century teacher Jalaluddin Rumi refers to this indirect operational quality of stories, which one often observes in action, through an actual tale, a tale explaining how a tale can work. There was once a merchant who kept a parrot imprisoned in a cage. When about to visit India on a business trip, he said to the bird, "I am traveling to your homeland. Can I give any message to your relatives there?" "Simply tell them," said the parrot, "that I am living here in a cage." When the merchant returned, he said to the parrot, "I am sorry to have to tell you that when I found and informed your wild relatives in the jungle that you were caged, the shock was too much for one of them. As soon as he heard the news, he dropped from his branch, no doubt having died from grief. Immediately he had spoken, the parrot collapsed and lay inert on the floor of his cage. Sorrowfully, the merchant took him and placed him outside in the garden. Then the parrot, having got the message, sat up and flew away out of reach. We must not think either that this exhausts the symbolism of this story, or that it will necessarily appeal to everyone. Rumi himself once said that counterfeit gold is only to be found because there is such a thing as real gold to be copied. And there is a true story of something which took place in Britain not so long ago, which verifies our experience that many of our stories, and especially the events in them, appear on the surface to be so trivial to so many people that they reject them completely. A jeweller in Birkenhead, Cheshire, in England, wanted to get people into his shop. He handed out 3,000 stones to people in the street. They all looked like real diamonds, but all but 4 of them were glass. He explained, in a leaflet given to each recipient, that there were real diamonds among the giveaway stones. Whoever got a stone of any kind was invited to visit the jewellery store to find out if they had been lucky. Out of the 3,000 people getting the stones, only one, a woman, actually turned up at the shop. She was right, she had a genuine diamond. All the rest of the people, presumably, thought that they were all fakes. The real diamonds had been as quickly discarded as the spurious. Now, if this kind of thing can happen with things as concrete as stones, and if people are, in general, as neglectful of possibilities as to provide only one individual in 3,000 to have hope for success, you can see an instant analogy with our own experience. The analogy includes the minus factors that people can call us fakes for peddling silly old stories and refuse to seek further. It also carries with it, however, the plus that enough people think that we are harmless peddlers of old stories to allow us to continue on our way. Both the Quran in the 7th century and the writings of Rumi in the 13th, and many other books, have been opposed by wiseacres and the wise on exactly the grounds that they were just filled with old fables, which could not possibly be of any use to anyone. So we remain in respectable company. But even fables, stories of less deep outer messages than that of indirect teaching, can be used, and are widely used, to accustom even quite small children to the future realities of life in the Middle East and Central Asia, the heartland of my basic culture. But you do not have to be a child to accept or to reject stories as vehicles for psychological action or knowledge. When someone asked me on BBC Radio once why I used so many of other people's tales and did not make up any of my own, I said that nobody had asked me for my own. So the interviewer, of course, immediately asked me to tell an original one, which I did. A friend of mine had the radio on in his office at the time and asked his secretary what she thought of it. She said, "No wonder nobody ever asks him. His stories are terrible." But the main reason to adopt traditional tales is, of course, that you don't try to manufacture your own instrument if you already have a range of them, superbly made and totally effective, fashioned by master craftsmen. From the Sufi understanding of human thinking, of course, the secretary could hardly be expected to rave about a story if she had other priorities on her mind. It is never easy to get publishers, for instance, to publish collections of Sufi tales if they first see the manuscript and judge that they are of what they call uneven quality. Judging the tales for punch, humour, interest, or whether they say anything to you at a given moment is using the stories in a way in which they are not intended to be used. An instrument is useful or not, according to whether the circumstances are correct. Copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.